Well, I trust everybody has the handout. I see the Bush family's with us this morning. It's good to have you. I hope you have a moderate preterist view of the Olivet Discourse, because if you don't, okay. We might have some interesting questions. Now, this morning we're looking actually at the last part of chapter 24, and let me just go ahead and begin by reading that portion, which appears to be a parable, slightly different perhaps than the ordinary parable, because he's really using the illustration of a servant, I think, as an analogy of not even an analogy. I mean, we actually are servants. We ought to be doing these things. We ought to be faithful. But many treat it as a parable. I'm not sure that it really matters one way or the other, since the instruction is the same. But this is what Jesus says, beginning in verse 45. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and shall begin to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour which he does not know, and shall cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. Weeping shall be there, and the gnashing of teeth. Now we're going to get to this parable really more towards the end of what we're looking at this morning, but I want to just remind us of where we're at. We've been looking at the Olivet Discourse. We understand that Jesus here is speaking to his disciples about what is going to happen to Jerusalem in the near future, actually within the distance or the time frame of one generation, since he says both in chapter 23 that the curses he's just pronounced will fall on this generation. And then he says in chapter 24, verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. He is answering the disciples' questions that they pose at the beginning of chapter 24 that has to do with what they understood him to be saying, that their house is going to be left desolate. Their house, of course, being the house of God, at least it was the house of God until they rejected Jesus Christ. Once he leaves, then he says, it's your house, and your house is going to be left desolate. And then that's the reason why they struck the questions that they did at the beginning of chapter 24, is because they understood that Jesus was saying something about the temple. So they began pointing out all these temple buildings to him and asking the questions. Jesus actually tells them, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. They ask him the questions, when is this going to be? What's the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And then Jesus begins to explain. And what he's talking about, again, are those things that will happen within the time frame of one generation. So Jesus spoke these things in 30 A.D., and they actually take place in 70 A.D., which is within the space of one generation. Now, having given them the signs of its approach, the signs the sign when it's fully come, and then what's going to happen after it's over, Jesus goes into a series of warnings. And we looked at the first warning last week in verses 32 through 44, when Jesus says, with regard to the fig tree, when you see the fig tree putting out its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, the things, he said, which were the warning signs, then they were to know that his judgment was near. He tells them in verse 34 that, again, that generation would not pass away. He says, this generation, speaking about those who are living then, this generation, not that far distant generation, but this generation, would not die off until all these things had taken place. He then enforced his words in the strongest possible way. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall not pass away. It's the same formula he uses in Matthew chapter 5 when he talks about the fact that nothing is going to pass away from the law. And therefore, those who are in the kingdom of heaven need to keep them and teach them. And if we don't do that, then we'll be the least in the kingdom, perhaps worse than that, not in the kingdom at all. Okay? But the fact that heaven and earth won't pass away, they will pass away actually, but his words would not. He's simply emphasizing everything that he has said up to this point. It's going to happen just as he said, and it's going to happen within this generation. He affirmed that it was his Father's will that they don't know the exact day or the hour. We saw that that's something even Jesus, while he was on earth, did not understand or did not know because it had not been revealed to his human nature by God, or by his divine nature, we might say. Because the human nature of Jesus Christ does not contain all the knowledge of his divine nature. He has a finite human mind being fully man. And because the Lord didn't reveal that to Jesus, he had not intended that to be revealed to the disciples so that the disciples would be ready for this event at all times, because it's going to happen within a 40-year time frame. If you knew exactly when it was going to get ready, then you might not be quite as motivated if you knew it was coming all the way at the end of the 40 years to be busy about the Lord's work. So he doesn't tell them the exact day of the hour so that they would be ready at all times and be about his work, and we're going to see that that's what these parables also are meant to encourage them to do. His coming, he said, would be unexpected. Some would be ready, some would not be ready. He's telling them so that they would be ready. And then he said, since it would be unexpected like a thief, they were always to be on the alert. Now that's what we saw last week in the first of a series of warnings. After he's told them all about 70 AD, he's giving them these warnings so that they'll be on the alert at all times and ready. Now the rest of the discourse, which takes up the remainder of chapter 24 and all of chapter 25, consists in several warnings, each with a slightly different emphasis, we might say, that are all aimed at encouraging the disciples to be ready and to be about their master's work. And here's just a brief overview of what we're going to look at over the next couple of weeks. The first is the one we're looking at this morning, the parable of the faithful servant, which emphasizes the fact that if you are faithful, doing what I've called you to do, Jesus says, then you can expect a great reward. But if instead you use your position for your own gain, then you'll find a very serious penalty at the end, actually, very serious consequences. You will be thrown into the lake of fire. He says in the second parable, the parable of the 10 virgins, that because they don't know when his coming is, they need to be ready at all times. I think we understand that if we know the parable of the 10 virgins very well. The third parable is that of the talents, where the Lord begins to give us some indication that he's going to be gone for a while, and he's entrusted certain things to his servants. And when he comes back, he expects them to have been busy about his work and having made some profit for him while they were gone, or while he was gone, so that when he returns, he might receive back what he's expecting, and they might be rewarded. So the idea here is that they are to be advancing the kingdom while he's gone. And then the final thing that happens in the Olivet Discourse is the sheep and goat judgment, which he includes, I believe, to show them that what they do makes a difference. If they spend their whole lives doing nothing, if they spend their whole lives wasting their time or living for their own pleasure, then they're going to have to give an account for that on the day of judgment. But if they are busy doing the Lord's work, then they will enter into the kingdom that has been prepared for them from the foundation of the world. It does remind us that our profession, when we get to this, we're going to see this, but it reminds us that the Lord is not going to judge us by what we profess. He's going to judge us by what we do, because our actions do speak louder than our words. I mean, we might say we're Christians all day long, but if we don't live as Christians, we're really not Christians. It doesn't matter what we say. What really matters is what we actually do. And you can see how that, well, actually, we're going to see how that fits into this whole scheme when we look at our next question here. And the next question is, and this is the one where we might have some disagreement possibly, but we do know that when Jesus begins the Olivet Discourse, that he is answering questions that have to do with 70 AD and God's judgment upon the Jewish nation. But the question is, well, it's not put this way, but we do know that by the time he gets to the end of the Olivet Discourse, he's talking about the second coming and the final judgment. That's what the sheep and goat judgment is. The big question is, where does he transition from one to the other? Where does he move from talking about 70 AD to talking about the second coming of Christ? Okay? That's what we're going to look at now for a few moments, and I don't know that I have the definitive answer. I've already moved beyond where most people draw the line. Okay? As a matter of fact, I'm almost tempted to move it all the way in and snuggle it right up against the sheep and goat judgment, because up to this point, Jesus, everything he says has been, I think, with 70 AD primarily in view. But let's just, again, review the different options that we have here. Okay, there are those who believe, as you know, the vast majority of the evangelical church today, and I'd be very surprised if you haven't been exposed to it at some point in your lives, believe that what Jesus is referring to here has to do exclusively with the future and with the 70th week of Daniel. And we've talked about that before in several different contexts now, but they do believe that when Jesus presented himself as the Messiah, that the Jews rejected him, and there's certainly no question about that. But they believe that they rejected him at the beginning of the 70th week and put the 70th week on hold, or at least God put it on hold. And he intends in the future to turn back to the Jews and to basically deal with them with the 7-year period, the 70th week of Daniel, with the tribulation, the Great Tribulation, the Antichrist, and you've probably heard all of those things. So they believe that all the things that are going on here are referring to the future, and they believe that when Jesus says that this generation will not pass away, that what he really means is that this race of people will not pass away. I'll make sure that I keep the Jews preserved as a nation, as a people. They won't cease to exist as this ethnic group until I brought the 70th week on them. But actually, we did a survey of the word generation. Every use of it in the book of Matthew has to do with that generation then living, and also specifically their character, which was evil in every instance. Okay. There are those who take a radical view as well and actually relegate all of it to the past. Everything in 24 and 25, including the sheep and goat judgment. We call that, of course, radical preterism, and they believe that all prophecy has been fulfilled. We're in the new heavens and the new earth. Now, everyone else, though, sees it referring to both, but they differ as to where the transition lies between the one or the other. So let me give you some of those options just to remind you of what they were. Some believe the transition comes really at Matthew 24:34, where Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." And everything up to that point, since he's given the time marker there, he says all of this is going to take place within this generation, but then he moves on to talk about the second coming. And they see a transition perhaps at that point. The problem with that, though, is that Jesus begins to give them a series of warnings based upon what he's already said to be ready for when he comes. So it doesn't seem likely that he would just shift gears entirely into the future at this point. Okay. Some believe that Jesus alternates between the two judgments throughout chapter 24, sometimes saying certain things about one of the events and sometimes saying things about the other. And the reason why they believe that, I think that was John Murray's position, is because they believe that the questions that the disciples ask in verse 3, tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? They see those questions as referring to the two events. The event of his coming in 70 AD when the temple is going to be torn down. The sign of his coming, though, would be perhaps the future event and the end of the age. It seems to be referring to the very end at the second coming of Christ when he puts an end to human history. But we've already looked at another possible meaning of those questions, and that Jesus is actually identifying them all as the same event. Okay, the sign of your coming is his coming in judgment against them. The end of the age is the end of that period of time between 30 and 70 AD, which would be the closure of the Old Covenant era. Jesus said on an earlier occasion that all sins would be forgiven, whatever sins you commit, but the sin against the Holy Spirit, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, would never be forgiven, not in this age or the age that is coming. And it seems unlikely that he meant by that it wouldn't be forgiven in this age or in the eternal state. Because if there's only one age left and the end of the age is basically ended by the second coming of Christ, and he means the same thing in both instances. What he's saying is if this sin isn't going to be forgiven during your life, but it's not going to be forgiven in the eternal state either, if that's the case, well, how does that differ than any other sin? Because if there's a sin not forgiven now, it's not going to be forgiven then either, right? I think what he's referring to here is the end of the Old Covenant era, which did continue for a one generation period, from the time Jesus was crucified to the time the temple was destroyed. It wasn't effective anymore. I mean, Jesus put an end to it when he was crucified on the cross and the veil was torn, but they continued to do that. The Lord gave them this 40-year transitional period to call out his elect, call out his sheep from Israel and from the Gentiles before he brought judgment on the Jews. But also he seems to be, because the Old Covenant era had been in force for such a long time, gives them that period of time just to adjust, as it were, even for his own people to adjust, moving from one to the other. So the idea here is that Jesus is not really answering three different questions, there are three questions or two different events throughout here, but he's really addressing only one event, and that's 70 AD. And I think when we look at verse 34 again, we have to at least conclude from verse 34 that Jesus saw everything that he said before verse 34 as actually taking place within a one-generation time frame. So that he was speaking about two different events. Let's say he was, just for the sake of argument, when we get to verse 34, Jesus tells us all these things are going to take place. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. The problem with that is that all these things then on that view would not take place, for some of them, for a couple thousand years, several thousand years. I think as I remember Murray's position too, I think he believes that the word "these things" is sort of a technical phrase that Jesus is using. He's talking about these things will happen within this generation, but there's certain things in here that aren't going to take place. So I think that's how he answers that question. Let's see. Okay, one other option is that because the two events of the judgment in 70 AD and the second coming of Christ are so similar that some believe that Jesus is really referring to both all the way through. But again, I do think that verse 34 tells us that Jesus was not looking to the future at that point. Well, he was at least 40 years into the future. He wasn't looking at the far distant future, but he was looking at what was going to happen within a one-generational time frame. Okay. All right, so I wanted to suggest another couple of possibilities, and this is something that when I preached through the book of Matthew back in 2001, 2002, I think it is, I remember struggling with the issue there. I mean, you have to deal with it. Where does the transition take place? I don't think these other options are correct. So here's some other possibilities. Okay, the first one would be that he deals with the second coming, beginning with the sheep and goat judgment. Okay, because there is a very strong transition in verse 31 of Matthew chapter 25. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him. Now, that's the first time that he has said something like that in Matthew 24 and 25. Certainly, he makes allusion to his return in these different parables, but the question is whether it's referring to the AD 70 return, coming in judgment, where he tells the high priest, "You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. You'll see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God and coming on the clouds with power." That's what he says, and he tells the high priest, that's what you're going to see. There was a coming of Christ, and the question is, which coming is it referring to in these parables? Is it referring to the second coming? Is it referring to the 70 AD coming in judgment? It's quite possible that all the parables are actually referring to the 70 AD coming. And he begins with the second coming in the sheep and goat judgment. Let's see. A couple of differences. I mean, he does say he's going to come on the clouds with power and great glory and judgment in the 70 AD coming. But here when he comes in his glory, he's accompanied... here he comes in his glory, accompanied by the angels to sit on his throne of judgment. and has gathered all the nations before him. Up to this point, we haven't seen that actually take place. Now, there's a couple of reasons then why Jesus might have addressed this at the end of the Olivet Discourse, why he adds it in, because that's a question we need to ask. Why does he transition from one to the other? A couple of possibilities. He may have been warning his disciples that even as he has told them that they need to be ready for his coming in judgment in 70 AD, because it's going to be unexpected, and busily being about what it is he's called them to do, as we've seen in these parables, or at least briefly looked at. They need to realize that how they conduct themselves is also going to be relevant to what happens on Judgment Day, whether or not they have been busily doing what the Lord has called them to do. So what their faithfulness is not only going to impact whether they're ready for 70 AD, it's also going to impact whether they're ready for the final judgment. Are they going to be faithful? Another possibility is this, that 70 AD is so similar to the final judgment that it's basically a picture of it, and it flows into it. So Jesus is simply starting with one, but then realizing that the similarity between the events is going to be so close, he just simply flows into that as well, again, because it is relevant to their present situation. Let me ask you, is the final judgment relevant to where we are today? Should it impact the way that we live? Realizing we're going to have to stand before God, we do want to make sure that we are in Christ, and we want to make sure that we're faithfully doing what the Lord has called us to do. Even though it's a long ways off, perhaps, and even though we may be young or old, maybe we think we have a few years left on this earth, it still matters how we live. We need to make sure that we are living with that day in view at all times. So Jesus gives them that day as an incentive to pay attention to what he's told them to do, as well as the possibility of escaping Jerusalem when 70 AD comes. As he's already warned his disciples earlier, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by her enemies, then get out of the country. You know, if you're on the rooftop, don't even go down to get anything out of the house. You don't have time. If you're in the field, don't turn back to get your coat. You don't have time. Get out if you want to escape. If you don't escape, judgment's going to be severe. Now, something that isn't in your handout that also is a possibility, and I didn't know exactly where to put this, but since we're edging back now and gulping up perhaps a little bit more of the text and perhaps trying to find the transition a little bit earlier, which is still possible, it is possible that he begins shifting towards the second coming in the parable of the talents. Because at this particular point, he no longer applies it to his disciples specifically. And we're going to see that as I look at the third possibility, which on your handout is the second possibility. But the last time that Jesus applies anything that he says here specifically to his disciples is actually in verse 13 of chapter 25. Be on the alert then, for you do not know the day nor the hour. He has just applied the parable of the 10 virgins to his disciples as he's been applying everything else that he's said up to this point. But from that point on, he doesn't actually say you any longer, at least when he's applying it to the disciples. So it could be that the shift takes place there, because also in the parable of the talents, you do have a reference to the fact that the master is going for a long time. He's going on a long journey. And then when he comes back, there's going to be a day of reckoning, right? Of course, there's reckoning in the other parables too, which is why there's still some ambiguity there. But just to make that point, the last time that Jesus actually applies this personally, specifically, explicitly to his disciples is verse 13 at the end of the parable of the 10 virgins. Now, the next possibility, and the reason why I'm bringing it up here is because it could be that this is where he shifts, right where we're looking at this morning. That he's basically concluded with verse 44 of chapter 24 most of what he wanted to say with regard to 70 AD specifically, but then goes on to a series of warnings that really applies to both 70 AD and the second coming because of their similarities and because what they do in and around 70 AD is also going to impact what happens to them on the day of judgment. Okay? The two are related. Not just because they're both judgments, but because they're both going to be, both of those judgments are going to be subject to both of those. They want to escape both of them. So in order to escape one, they have to be ready. In order to escape the other, they have to be faithfully doing what the Lord has called them to do. Okay, faithfulness is a prerequisite of heaven. It's something that the Lord does. It's not something we do in order to merit our salvation, but it certainly is something that must be true of us if we are to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Only those who are faithful, and we'll see that in this particular parable when we actually get to it. Okay. Now, certainly what he is saying in our text this morning is connected to 70 AD. He even applies the parable of the 10 virgins to them, so he's still applying this to 70 AD. Okay, be on the alert. You do not know the day or the hour. We've already seen that. But there are some things that in our text that can be seen as indicators that he's beginning to shift towards the other event too. And again, as an encouragement to be faithful during the years around 70 AD, he points forward to the second coming. But here's a few things that seem to indicate a shift. Now, the reason why this may be a little bit complicated is because it's a complicated subject. I could just simply give you the answer, but I wanted to give you some of the process so that maybe you could come to your own conclusions on it as well. But the first thing that appears to signal this shift is that Jesus is not applying what he is saying as intensely to his disciples as he was before. In the first 44 verses of chapter 24, he applies what he says to them personally at least 19 times. One example is, see to it that no one misleads you. That's where we begin, I think. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of war. See that you are not frightened. And here you have all the references where he applies, and you can see that he applies it a number of times. But beginning in our text, in verse 45, to the end of chapter 25, and I want to remind you too that the chapters, Jesus did not, obviously he didn't write himself, but Matthew, when he wrote this, he didn't write chapter 1 and then do this, and then chapter 2 and do this. If you were to look at the early manuscripts, you'd find just a huge block of letters from the beginning to the end with no chapter divisions, no verse divisions, no sentence divisions, no punctuation, no spaces between words. I mean, that's what the Greek text looks like. It's just a solid block of letters, okay? All these divisions were put in later. And they're not just arbitrary. The person who put them in there was trying to divide subject matter the way that we would do when we're writing an essay. We put, or maybe a more lengthy chapter or essay. When we're writing a book, we have chapter 1, chapter 2, and so forth. Paragraph 1, paragraph 2. The editor of this particular Bible that I have shows me where the paragraphs begin and end by using bolded numbers. And it divides, of course, up into chapters and verses, as you have too, so that we can find these things easily. If we had this even without any division at all, it was just one big chapter, the book of Matthew, and we had no numbers, we had no chapters, and I said, okay, turn to this particular place in the Scriptures. How hard would it be to find it? This is here for our convenience so that we can locate it quickly and know what we're talking about, okay? Now, as I mentioned, I say that because we might think that this chapter 25 division here is hard and fast and that this is something that Jesus put there or something that Matthew put there, but it's really something that another human editor put there, okay? So we don't have to see that as a hard and fast division. As a matter of fact, the subject matter is pretty much still the same. And maybe that chapter should continue on into the next chapter, and maybe chapters 24 and 25 should just be one big chapter, because it's one discourse, right? So don't get fooled by that, okay? Now, from verse 45 to the end of the chapter, he really only applies what he says once, and we've already seen that one application in chapter 25, verse 13. Be on the alert then, for you do not know the day or the hour, and that comes at the end of the parable of the 10 virgins. So I want you to note that he's still connecting it to them and to 70 AD, because otherwise he's shifted gears entirely and he'd leave his disciples sort of behind as far as what he's talking about if he meant to refer that only to the second coming, because up until this point he's been talking about 70 AD. And to make a shift like that could be confusing in the eyes of his disciples. But it does begin to hedge towards the second coming, and they can see that by the time he gets to the end of this discourse, as we're going to see it as well. Now, notice secondly, that Jesus begins to speak of longer periods of time in these warnings. Chapter 24, verse 48, my master is not coming for a long time. Now, that might have been presumption on the part of the servant, but here's a reference to longer time. 25, verse 5, in the parable of the 10 virgins, while the bridegroom was delaying. Seems like they're expecting him, but he's not coming yet. Especially when we get to the talents, and that's why I think that's a very plausible place where he shifts gears. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. And remember that is never applied to the disciples, specifically or explicitly. And then, of course, in verse 31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, which doesn't necessarily connote long periods of time, but certainly an unexpected period of time, could leave the door open for just about any time frame. Now, why does Jesus begin to speak about longer periods of time? There's several different possibilities. Remember, he is still referring it to 70 AD. 40 years is a pretty long time. So they needed to be guarding themselves against becoming slothful during that time frame. Again, we looked at that, I think, not too long ago, and we considered the fact that if you know something is going to happen 40 years from now, the tendency is to waste a lot of time and then to get ready towards the last minute. I think that's human sinful nature. It's called procrastination. When we're in school and we have an assignment that's due and we have a whole semester to do it, when do we usually get started on it? It's usually within a week or two when it's due, instead of beginning right away and getting it done ahead of time. That's just the way we are. These things are meant to hedge that off, perhaps. Okay, the idea of the long period of time, there's warnings not to waste that time, so they need to be faithfully doing, otherwise they're going to be caught off guard. Certainly that has application to 70 AD. It could certainly have application to the end of their lives, to make sure that with this long period of time could be referring to human life as well. We need to make sure that we're being faithful throughout our lives, not just presuming we're going to live to be 80 or 90 years old, and if we happen to be only 20 years old now, thinking that I've got so much time, I can do all these kinds of things, and I can still get ready when I'm approaching the end of my life. That's presumption. Certainly it's a long time from when Jesus spoke these things to the time of the second coming. 2,000 years almost has elapsed and he still hasn't come. So all of his people need to be ready for judgment. The idea of time frames here. Long period of time. Don't let a long period of time make you think that you can goof off or procrastinate. You need to be ready at all times because you don't know when the end of your time is going to be. For the disciples, they don't know when he's coming. It's going to be sometime within a generational time frame, but they don't know exactly when. He didn't want them to know exactly when, so they'd be ready at all times and faithfully doing. We need that kind of motivation. We don't know when we're going to die. We don't know when Christ is coming again, but I think the time of our death may be much sooner than his second coming. Okay, all right. Thirdly, first of all, he doesn't apply it as intensely to them personally, explicitly. Secondly, he seems to be referring to longer time frames. Thirdly, he speaks of a punishment that the wicked will receive at the end of these warnings that goes beyond what the Romans could inflict on them, with the exception of cutting in pieces. I think they're able to do that. But in chapter 24, verse 51, and he shall cut them in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. Weeping shall be there and the gnashing of teeth. That seems to go beyond the judgment of 70 AD and what the Romans can do. Okay, assigning a place with the hypocrites, I suppose the Romans certainly have swords, they can cut you in pieces. They could maybe not assign you a place ultimately with hypocrites, but they could certainly make you criminals and assign you that place, and people who are being tormented by them will be weeping and gnashing their teeth. But I think the reference looks beyond that to something much more serious. Chapter 25, verse 12, at the end of the parable of the 10 virgins, truly I say to you, I do not know you. The consequence of not being ready, Christ disowns him, the bridegroom. That certainly goes beyond what the Romans can do. The end of the parable of the talents. Cast the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Certainly that goes beyond what the Romans can do. And then verse 41 at the end of the sheep and goat judgment. Depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. That's a consignment to the lake of fire. Okay. Now, even though the punishments go beyond what 70 AD is referring to, it also has relevance to 70 AD because their conduct before, during, and after 70 AD is going to determine what's going to happen at the end of these judgments. They still have to be faithful, so the relevance of the warning could still apply to 70 AD, but it clearly looks beyond 70 AD now to final punishment. So we do see that transition here. I don't think Jesus has made reference to that anywhere in chapter 24 up to this point. Okay? And then finally, on the other side, he speaks of a reward that the righteous are going to receive, which is greater than anything that they might receive on earth. The parable of the faithful servant. Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. And then at the end of the parable of the talents, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. We did skip over the parable of the 10 virgins, which refers to the 5 virgins who were ready and faithful entering into the wedding feast. That's certainly a reward as well. And then at the end of the sheep and goat judgment, come you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Now again, it's looking forward to a reward which is greater than the one that they would receive in 70 AD, which at that time would just be saving their lives by escaping, getting out of the country. But it still has relevance to them in 70 AD because if they are not faithfully doing what the Lord calls them to do, well, actually, if they're not faithful, they'll get the punishment. If they are faithful, then they will receive the reward at the end of at the end of human history, at the last judgment. Okay, so the point of this is to show that there is some kind of transition taking place within these parables, beginning where we're at, because it's not applied as explicitly, and because of the fact of the time frames that are being mentioned seem to indicate longer time frames. The idea of the punishment, the idea of the reward seems to be shifting its focus more towards the second coming, although it hasn't left 70 AD behind. It still has 70 AD in view. Okay. Now, why do I want to labor that point? It's simply for this reason. If these things are beginning to shift towards the second coming, that means that what Jesus says from this point on has a much more intimate relevancy to us than what he said before. Because we don't have to be looking for false Christs and false prophets. We don't have to be worried about wars and rumors of wars, although we have all of that stuff anyway. It's not really an indication of Christ's second coming. We don't need to pay attention to that, but what we do need to pay attention to is the fact that we need to be faithfully doing what God has called us to do. We need to be ready at all times because we could die at any time. He could come for us. We need to have the final judgment in view at all times. That does apply to us. Okay, not the things that happened back here in 70 AD or prior to 70 AD. That had to do with them. It certainly confirms for us that the Word of God is true because it did come to pass. Those who were ready got out. But these things immediately apply to us. So we need to take these more to heart in certain senses. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Michael?
In the past, I've been favorable to predators. I've read about predators' doctrine and I'm not against it, but here's my the 10 virgins. Okay, let's say that applied just to the destruction of 70 AD. How do the ones who were prepared enter into the marriage? They were still, if it's applied that way, it's got to be
Okay, now you heard me say, did you, that it applies to both?
I did hear you, but
Okay.
to me, it just kind of.
Now, let me ask you this question. Are any of the people or any of the believers who lived around 70 AD, who actually went through 70 AD, are any of them going to enter into the marriage feast?
What do you mean because they died?
Well, because I think
Well, my point is,
I have to think.
kind of stretching them to say that this has something to do with, that the 10 virgins has something to do with the 70 AD.
Well-
Because, I mean, it's obvious maybe from that the ones who stayed in the city were going to be damned to hell.
Well, let me ask you this question. Does the parable of the 10 virgins apply to us here?
I've always thought so.
Okay. Now, it doesn't just apply to the last generation when Christ actually comes, right? But it applies to everyone who lives before that time as well, which means it applies just as much to these believers in 70 AD as it applies to us today, right?
Well, the question I would bring up then is how does it apply today? And here's how I would say it's applied. That these virgins were all Orthodox. They weren't idolaters. They weren't committing scandalous sins. Outwardly, they looked good. 50% of them go to hell. That could be applied today so that those who are in the visible, who attend congregations, who look outwardly, the percentages are against them. At the time of the Puritans, they feared a false profession of faith. Today we go in churches and they think, I don't care what kind of churches, you go Pado Baptist or Baptist, and who are Orthodox. They normally believe that the majority of their members are converted. The Puritans did not believe that. There were writers of the Westminster Divines who did not believe that.
Well, that's certainly true.
That's the application I would make.
Right,
That's
but
the application I'm from.
but let me ask you this question. Does what you've just said have no relevancy to 70 AD?
Well, I agree. I know, I would say
Okay.
it is, but I'm just saying that that was.
So you're asking the question, though, how does this apply to them? And I'm just saying it applies to them in the same way it applies to us. They need to guard their hearts against hypocrisy. They need to be ready when Christ comes, not just in 70 AD, but they need to be ready to meet him, you see.
Well, I think the red there is an examination of whether I'm truly converted. That the point is there is that to say that readiness was that they got out of Jerusalem in time.
That was part of it.
Yeah, well, that was the simple part.
Yeah. Well,
Because I think somebody could understand that and still not be converted.
right.
People who got
Certainly.
out of Jerusalem still-
But all I'm saying is that parable still has relevance to them, even as it has to us. Okay. I'm not saying it means that they just need to be ready to get out of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Okay. But what I'm saying is, like with these other parables, it goes beyond just being ready to get out of Jerusalem. It means being faithful to do what the Lord has called you to do and to be ready for him and to meet him. They had to be ready in 70 AD let me just say this. They had to be ready in 70 AD to meet the Lord as well as to be ready to get out of the city. Okay?
Now, in the parable before, there's no really, it just says, it talks about it's blessed to be a faithful servant, but the judgment is the weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's always, in my opinion, a sign they're going to hell. They're going to be cast into hell.
I think so.
It doesn't say here, they could be cast into hell at any time. It doesn't really say anything here about what's going to happen to the faithful. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say that I see that distinctly different than when I see the
Which parable doesn't it say what?
the one just before, like verse 51. All it's saying there is there's going to be a judgment that's going to come. They're going to get cut asunder. They're going to have their portion with the hypocrites, and they're going to be cast into hell. That could have happened then. It didn't really positively say what would happen to the person. It didn't say positively on the other side, those who were righteous, what's going to happen.
Well,
It's just telling you what's going to happen to the wicked.
Actually, it does. Look at verse 47. Verse 46 says, "Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions." So that's the positive reward. Okay? And I think that that's referring to inheriting the kingdom of heaven. Okay?
So we know that so here's, well, then that, okay, you got a good point there. Now I would have to say, did the people who survived the destruction of Jerusalem inherit the goods at that time?
Okay. Again, maybe what I said didn't come across very clearly, but what I mean is that Christ, first of all, he's obviously applying this to them, okay, in 70 AD, to those who lived there. I mean, he spoke it to them. And he says at the end of the parable of the 10 virgins, and this is something you'd have to reckon with if it didn't have to do with them, in verse 13, be on the alert then, for you do not know the day nor the hour. Now, everything that we would like to do with these parables, as far as applying them to us, being ready to meet the Lord at any time because we might die, and the possibilities of heaven and hell, all apply to them too. And I think that that's how it's applying to them, but I think at the same time that Jesus is also indicating that sort of the added benefit of their being ready is they're also going to be ready to escape this judgment that's coming in 70 AD. So he's applying it, I think, to both, but obviously if you are walking with the Lord and you're faithful to the Lord and you're genuinely converted, you're going to be much more ready for 70 AD as well as the final judgment. Because he is, there's a shift that takes place here.
I guess my point I'm trying to make is it's in the application. What is until I specifically say what was the application to the people before 70 AD? If the application is they're still being warned, get out of there, and maybe the application is a soul searching look at their life to see indeed are they truly converted. That would apply to them, but to say that it was a warning, the issue was the issue was get out of Jerusalem, it's going to be destroyed. Well, they should get out of Jerusalem because they don't want to be around it unless they want to see the Lord early. I'm trying. My issue is what is the actually application? I agree it applies to both of them. Okay, I even believe the first part now applies to even believers today, but in a different way. And I think Edwards talked about that in his book, History of Redemption. He develops that, how this would apply, how would this apply to them?
Okay, yeah, I don't think that there's any difference between what we're saying. If we see them, we see that the Lord meant to apply that both to 70 AD and to the second coming. The fact that his coming is going to be unexpected and they need to be ready for it is one thing, but they need to be faithfully doing what the Lord has called them to do so that they'll be ready for both. But I think he's primarily beginning to shift towards the second coming so that they'll be ready for judgment is certainly an issue that's there. And if we had the time, which we're not going to have this morning, to get into this first parable, I was going to show how it applies to them and to us and get into those applications I think that you're concerned about, because it certainly does apply to us in that way. But I do think that there's still an element that he's communicating to them of being ready in 70 AD, that it's not exclusively the second judgment, but he's still making reference to 70 AD. That still has application there. So I think there's two applications, actually. The one that you're concerned about, as well as the other one.
And here's what I think is the danger of all the positions. I don't care for pre-mill, on-mill, or post-mill. I've got friends in all these areas. Here's the danger, I think, is they know what's going to happen tomorrow. In their mind, they're saying something about, oh, maybe God can't, some positions go and say, oh, God can't have an outpouring of the Spirit tomorrow. They're putting restraints on God about what's going to happen tomorrow. Do they really know that? That's the danger I see with this. I'm not saying the Scripture doesn't teach something. Just, we got to be careful here.
Okay, maybe we can talk about that offline, because I'm not sure exactly how that fits in here. We certainly don't want to be presumptuous. Is that what you're saying? Don't presume what tomorrow will bring. Don't limit God.
A lot of post-mills. I know a lot of preterist post-mills. They come off and they know what's going to happen tomorrow. And now I think that's nonsense.
Okay.
They don't know.
that's something we haven't discussed. That's why I didn't see the connection.
Well, I'm just
Okay.
saying it can happen in group. All mills are the same way, pre-mills are the same way. I'm just telling you that
Okay.
maybe that we're missing that point.
All right. Well, this is a convenient place to end. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, if not, let me just round it off by saying that I've shown you, obviously, that there is a transition between 70 AD and the Second Coming, somewhere between beginning of 24 and the end of 25. Clearly, what Jesus has said up to verse 34 has to apply to 70 AD. It does appear that he launches into a series of warnings, again, to help them get ready for 70 AD, but begins also to transition towards the Second Coming because their conduct around 70 AD is also going to determine the final outcome of their judgment. I mean, if they apostatize or if they are like the unfaithful servant, which we haven't looked at this morning, then even if they do escape 70 AD, they're still going to have to face God's judgment at the Second Coming, or actually when they die, and so forth. So I think that there's going to be a variety of applications, and I think that we're even, of course, in the mind of the Savior when he said this, to get them ready both for 70 AD and to get them ready for the final judgment, because the things that apply to them apply to us. Well, I should say the things that apply to us, the way we normally take these parables, which I think is correct, that we apply them to ourselves to get ready for the Second Coming, applied equally to them back then and added to them, gave them an added incentive to be ready at 70 AD, because that was not it wasn't irrelevant. That event was not unimportant. It was something they needed to be ready for, and it was something that they needed to conduct themselves properly. They needed to be spiritually ready to deal with that issue in a godly way and be faithful prior to its actual coming. They had 40 years that they had to be about their Lord's business before he came, and that certainly constitutes a long period of time, which I think Christ was telling them they not only need to be getting ready then for 70 AD, but during that time frame they need to be faithful, so they're going to be ready for the second judgment, the second coming. Not the second judgment, but the second coming. Alrighty, well, we'll try to review that again next week. We'll begin moving into the parables, and we'll look at them from both of those perspectives. Again, a warning to them as well as a warning to us. And it's the warning to us, of course, that's going to be, I think, most of a concern to us. We want to make sure that we are ready when the Lord calls us out of the world to be able to meet him. And in order to do that, we need to be faithfully doing what the Lord has called us to do, not externally, but I should say merely externally, but also from the heart. Well, let's have a word of prayer.